The drive felt endless. My girlfriend and I had been winding up this narrow, cracked mountain road for hours, surrounded by a wall of towering trees. No streetlights, no other cars in sight. Just us, the hum of the engine, and the endless stretch of road that seemed to curve on forever. The trees loomed closer, darker, twisting branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. The higher we climbed, the heavier the silence became. Even the birds seemed to fall silent as we drove deeper. I glanced over at her. She was staring out the window, eyes following the shadows that flickered as we passed. She had insisted on this trip, getting away, just us, she'd said. No distractions. I had shrugged, agreed. It wasn't like I had anything better to do. But now, as we left any semblance of civilization behind, I felt a slow chill settle in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, even if I couldn't put my finger on it. Eventually, we reached the cabin. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. Ivy snaked up the walls, moss clung to the rotting wood, and the path leading up to the door was nearly swallowed by weeds. I could smell dampness in the air, like old rot mixed with wet earth. The windows were dark, staring back at us like empty eyes. She laughed it off, nudging my shoulder. "It's perfect," she said, forcing a smile. But there was something tense in her voice, something almost forced. We stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust that clung to every surface. The floor creaked under our weight, each step echoing through the empty rooms. The cabin had a strange layout. Rooms connected in odd ways, narrow corridors leading nowhere. In one corner, a chair sat overturned, as if someone had left in a hurry, and it was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, makes you strain to hear anything just to break it. As we unpacked, she found an old journal tucked beneath the couch cushions. The leather cover was cracked, pages yellowed and worn. She flipped through it, frowning as she skimmed the entries. They were half-written, sentences trailing off in a frantic scrawl. Strange happenings, one line read. Unseen eyes, whispers in the night. She laughed nervously, tossing it aside. Someone must have been trying to spook the tourists, she said, though I noticed she didn't seem convinced. Later that night, after we'd settled in, the unease only grew. There were no animals, no distant hum of insects, just that thick, heavy silence, pressing in from every angle. We tried to laugh it off, to convince ourselves it was just the atmosphere of the place, but the laughter died quickly, replaced by a tense quiet. Then, just as we were beginning to relax, a sound of faint, almost imperceptible whisper, drifting from somewhere beyond the walls. I froze, straining to listen. There it was again, soft but unmistakable. She heard it too. I could tell by the way her eyes widened, her hand gripping mine just a little tighter. "Probably the wind," I muttered, though I didn't believe it myself. She nodded, but her gaze kept darting toward the windows, as if expecting to see something peering back. We lay in bed, the silence stretching between us. Every little creak, every small shift of the walls seemed amplified in the dark. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel. I tensed, holding my breath, but they stopped just as suddenly as they'd started. I told myself it was an animal. It had to be. But deep down, a part of me knew we weren't alone. I could feel it, a presence, something lingering just out of sight, watching us. The cabin felt alive, like it was breathing, waiting. She must have felt it too, because by morning her face was pale, eyes shadowed from a restless night. Neither of us spoke about the sounds, the strange sensations. We didn't need to. The fear was unspoken but shared. This was supposed to be a getaway, a chance to escape, but with every hour that passed, it felt more like a trap. That first night felt like it stretched on forever. We lay in bed, blanketed by a silence, so deep it was almost suffocating. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Faint scratching, like nails dragging slowly across the cabin's outer walls. I opened my eyes, staring up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the scratching continued, a deliberate sound, tracing the perimeter of the cabin. She was awake too, her breath shallow beside me. We both stayed silent, listening as the noise moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. Minutes passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside, lurking in the darkness, listening to us the way we listened to it. When the sound didn't return, I finally exhaled, telling myself it was just a branch and animal. Anything to calm my mind. The next day, as we tried to brush off the previous night, I started noticing things out of place. Small things. The door to the bedroom, which we'd left open, was closed when I walked by. A chair that I remembered being by the table was now against the wall. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when she froze, staring at the knife on the counter as it rolled slowly, deliberately, to the edge and fell. We looked at each other, a shared unease passing between us. Neither of us said a word, both silently pretending it was nothing, but I could tell it was getting to her. Later, as the day grew colder, a chill filled the cabin. We checked all the windows and doors, but everything was closed. Even the fireplace didn't seem to help. I walked through the cabin, hoping to find some draft, something to explain the bone-deep cold that clung to us, but there was nothing, just that same heavy silence. Then it happened. We were cleaning up after dinner, moving around in that uncomfortable quiet, when I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a faint glow through the window. I turned, peering out into the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from inside. But then I saw it, a figure, faint and glowing, moving slowly, as if gliding across the ground. It didn't walk like a person. It almost floated, its movements wrong in a way I couldn't describe. I felt my blood turn to ice. She saw it too, gasping and gripping my arm as we watched it drift closer, pausing just at the edge of the clearing in front of the cabin. Its head turned slowly, as if searching. Its shape was hazy, its edges blurred, like it wasn't fully there. The longer we looked, the more distorted it seemed, shifting and bending in a way that hurt to watch. She pulled at my arm, her voice barely a whisper, pleading, "Let's go. Right now." I could hear the fear in her voice, see the desperation in her eyes. But I shook my head, trying to stay rational, to keep us grounded. "It's just for the night," I said. "We'll leave in the morning." She looked at me, a mix of anger and fear, but she didn't argue. I could tell she didn't believe me, and maybe I didn't believe myself either. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the cabin made me jump. I started questioning every shadow, every flicker of movement. I felt watched, like eyes were on me no matter where I turned. She barely slept, curling up beside me, flinching at every sound. At one point, I got up to look outside, half hoping to see nothing, half fearing what I might find. But as I approached the window, a strange feeling washed over me, a sensation of being watched, even from behind. I turned around, but there was no one, just the same empty room, the dim glow of the moon casting odd shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something beyond the walls of this cabin was waiting, watching, studying us like we were animals in a cage. In that endless silence, I felt my mind start to slip, unable to tell if the things I saw, the shifting shadows, the moving objects, were real or just a trick of my own fear. I looked at her, pale and wide-eyed, and I knew she felt it too, that creeping dread eating away at any sense of safety. We were trapped here, surrounded by something we couldn't understand, something beyond any nightmare we could imagine. When I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. There was light spilling through the windows, but it wasn't morning sunlight. It was harsh, strange, almost like a dull, greenish glow. It cast twisted shadows across the walls, bathing the entire cabin in an unsettling hue. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was just some lingering effect of the nightmares from the night before, but it didn't go away. My girlfriend sat up beside me, her face as pale as I felt. "What is that?" she whispered, staring out the window. When I tried to check my phone, it wouldn't turn on. The battery had been full, but now it was dead. I reached for the flashlight we'd left on the nightstand, only to find it wouldn't switch on either. The sense of dread I'd been trying to ignore swelled into a full-blown panic. We were completely cut off. No phones, no light, nothing to break this feeling that the world had somehow shifted around us overnight. I looked outside, searching for anything that might explain the strange light. The sky was wrong. It was an eerie, unnatural shade of green and purple, with no sun in sight, only swirling clouds that moved too fast, bending and twisting like living things. I tried to tell myself it was just a storm, some atmospheric anomaly, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. My girlfriend looked at me, her eyes wide, and I knew she felt the same growing horror I did. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing across the roof. We froze, listening as they moved slowly from one side of the cabin to the other. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here, on top of a cabin in the middle of nowhere? She clutched my arm, her hand ice cold, and whispered, "We need to leave." As we gathered what little we had, I caught something in the bathroom mirror out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there, a figure, indistinct but unmistakable, standing behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty, the only reflection staring back my own, wide-eyed and pale. The temperature dropped suddenly, filling the air with a biting chill that seemed to seep into our bones. The cabin, already cold, became almost unbearable, as if whatever warmth had existed was being drained out, leaving only a numbing, lifeless cold. My girlfriend's teeth chattered as she clung to me, and we both shivered, feeling helpless against this creeping cold. Then I noticed the clock. It was stuck, the second hand frozen at midnight. I tapped it, shook it, but it wouldn't move. My watch, her phone. They all showed the same time, an unmoving midnight, as if time itself had stopped within the walls of this cabin. Outside, the strange light continued, casting everything in an endless twilight that seemed neither night nor day. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. We finally decided to make a break for it. Whatever was happening here, it felt like it was closing in on us, tightening around us like a trap. We packed up, threw on our coats, and stumbled out into the cold, eerie light. The path leading back down the mountain was barely visible in the strange glow, and the silence pressing around us, heavier than ever. We walked, one foot in front of the other, not daring to look back, just focusing on putting as much distance between us and that cabin as possible. But after what felt like hours, the trees parted, and we found ourselves standing right back in front of the cabin. I stared at it, heart pounding, trying to understand how we had ended up right back where we started. She looked at me, panic flaring in her eyes. We tried again, choosing another path, pushing through the thick underbrush, desperate to find some way out. But each time, no matter how far we walked, we ended up back at the cabin, as if the mountain itself were twisting and reshaping around us. Our desperation grew. The path, the forest, even the cabin all seemed to warp and change with each attempt. Shadows moved just at the edge of my vision, figures flickering through the trees like they were watching us, following us, waiting. My girlfriend clung to me, her breaths coming fast and shallow, her eyes darting in every direction, as if expecting something to emerge from the woods and swallow us whole. By then, I had no idea how much time had passed. Morning should have come, but the sky remained trapped in that strange, unnatural light. The landscape around us twisted, turning us around, pulling us back again and again to that same cursed spot. The reality of it sank in like a stone. There was no way out. The morning never came. That strange, sourceless light continued to glow around us, casting an unearthly, dim hue on everything. We felt drained, haunted by hours of futile attempts to escape the cabin's reach. In a desperate search for answers, we started scouring every inch of the cabin, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. In the back corner of a closet, I found an old lockbox, covered in dust, hidden beneath a pile of mildewed blankets. Inside were yellowed, fragile papers, research logs, scribbled notes. My girlfriend read over my shoulder, her face pale as she whispered the words aloud. The note spoke of dimensional distortions and temporal anomalies. Strange markings and symbols filled the margins, symbols that didn't look human, as if they had been copied from some ancient, forgotten language. The entries got increasingly frantic, talking about rifts opening up, strange energies flowing in and out, and an unidentified presence that could be felt but never seen. A chill ran down my spine as I flipped to the last page. It was a single line, scrawled in a shaky hand. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Leave before it finds you. The ink was smeared, as if whoever had written it had left in a hurry, or hadn't had time to leave at all. That's when we heard it, a deep, resonant hum, like a low-frequency vibration that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the cabin. It was more than a sound. It felt like it was coming from within us, vibrating through our bones, making it hard to breathe. The hum grew louder, morphing into a series of guttural alien sounds, echoing from all directions, as if it were coming from somewhere outside our reality. The light shifted, growing darker, and as we turned toward the window, we saw it. A figure, no, an entity, looming just outside the cabin. It was impossible to describe, as if my mind couldn't process its shape, but it was vast, almost liquid, its form twisting and undulating like smoke trapped in water, its edges blurred, shifting, like it was in several places at once, constantly shifting between one impossible form and another. It moved with an eerie grace, floating inches above the ground, radiating a darkness that seemed to drink in the strange light around it. We watched frozen, as it slid closer to the cabin, its gaze, or what I assumed was its gaze, fixing on us with an unnatural awareness. I felt a pressure in my head, a low buzzing, like thoughts not my own were invading my mind. Images flashed in my head, fractured, disjointed glimpses of other places, alien landscapes, voids of infinite darkness. I staggered back, clutching my temples, but the images only grew sharper, more intense, as if this thing was trying to make me understand, to imprint its reality onto mine. My girlfriend grabbed my arm, snapping me back to the present, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to go. Now." But before we could move, the entity's form surged forward, passing through the walls as if they weren't even there, filling the room with a numbing, freezing presence. Its shape twisted, limbs or tendrils stretching out, reaching for us with an otherworldly hunger. We backed away, frantic, but there was nowhere to run. In a panic, we scrambled toward the back of the cabin, but she stumbled, letting out a sharp cry as something cold and sharp wrapped around her ankle, dragging her back. I lunged, grabbing her hands, but my grip slipped as the entity's form shifted again, pulling her closer to its core. She let out a scream, her face twisted in terror as she looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. I pulled with everything I had, feeling a strength I didn't know I possessed, and finally managed to free her, dragging her away from the creature's grasp. We staggered to our feet, and I practically carried her as we made for the door, desperate to escape. But the cabin itself had started to change, the walls stretching, twisting, as if they were alive, warping into strange angles that defied logic. Every room we passed seemed to lead us back to where we started, looping in on itself in an impossible maze. The cabin felt less like a building and more like a prison, reshaping itself to keep us inside. The entity appeared again, emerging from the shadows, moving toward us with a terrible, patient certainty. My girlfriend clung to me, limping, her breathing shallow and quick. There was nowhere left to run, no way out. We backed up, trapped in a corner, feeling the walls close in around us. The creature loomed over us, its shifting form stretching to fill every inch of space, a vortex of darkness and cold. In that moment, I understood. We were no longer in the world we knew. The cabin, the forest, the mountains, it had all been pulled into some kind of pocket dimension, a place where reality itself was twisted, bent to this entity's will. We were caught in a web we couldn't see, a trap laid by a being beyond our comprehension. This wasn't just an encounter. It was an experiment, a study, and we were the subjects. I looked at my girlfriend, her face pale, her eyes wide with despair, and I knew we were out of options. There was no escaping this thing, no breaking free from its prison. The entity closed in, its form shifting, swirling, stretching toward us. And all I could do was hold her close, waiting as the darkness swallowed us whole. The air in the cabin had grown thick, suffocating, like the walls were pressing in on us. My girlfriend's injuries were bad, but she pushed herself up, her face set with determination. We didn't have to speak. We both knew this was our last chance. I grabbed her hand, and together, we ran, forcing the door open and stumbling out into the cold, surreal night. The world outside had changed. The forest was shrouded in that eerie greenish glow, the trees twisting and contorting, seeming taller and denser than before, their shapes unnatural and ominous. Behind us, the cabin loomed like a dark, silent predator, as if it had become part of the creature that hunted us. We started down the mountain, each step feeling like it took every ounce of strength we had left. Our breaths came out in shallow, panicked gasps, the air so cold it burned our lungs. But then we heard it. That low, inhuman hum returned, vibrating through the trees, resonating in our bones. I didn't dare look back, but I knew it was following us, changing the landscape around us, warping reality to keep us close. The ground shifted underfoot, sometimes stretching out like it wanted to keep us from moving forward, other times giving way entirely, sending us stumbling and fighting to regain our balance. We were running through a world that no longer obeyed natural laws, as if the very mountain itself had turned against us. Time became meaningless as we ran. We couldn't tell if minutes or hours passed, only that the oppressive, dark presence grew closer, driving us to the edge of exhaustion. Just as I was certain we'd never escape, we saw it. A car, an old, dusty sedan parked on a narrow, forgotten road cutting through the forest. It looked out of place, almost like a mirage, but it was real, and it was our only hope. We sprinted to it, our fingers numb and shaking as we struggled to open the doors. I slid into the driver's seat, slamming the key into the ignition, and miraculously, the engine sputtered to life. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the warped forest around us. I hit the gas, the tires skidding as we sped down the road, leaving the twisted trees and suffocating darkness behind. For the first time in what felt like eternity, I let out a shaky breath. My girlfriend leaned back, closing her eyes, relief washing over her face. The sense of terror began to ease, replaced by the steady, comforting hum of the car's engine as it roared down the mountain. We were alive. Somehow, we'd made it out. But as the road straightened out and the forest gave way to open land, something nagged at me, a cold unease settling in my gut. I glanced over at her, noticing for the first time strange, faint markings on her wrist. They looked almost like burns or scars, tiny circular patterns that spiraled and connected in unnatural shapes. I looked down at my own hands and saw the same marks, faint but unmistakable, tracing their way up my forearms like a twisted form of branding. A chill ran through me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just scratches from the underbrush or remnants of our fall. But deep down, I knew these marks weren't natural. They pulsed faintly under my skin, leaving a sensation that wasn't pain but something close, an awareness, a constant reminder of what we'd encountered. She noticed it too, her hand drifting over the markings, her expression going pale. We didn't speak, didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a silent agreement to ignore the nagging sense of dread, to keep driving and never look back. But then the radio, which had been silent since we started, crackled to life. It wasn't music or static, but something stranger, a low, familiar hum. The same unearthly sound we'd heard in the cabin, vibrating through the speakers, filling the car with that haunting, alien resonance. My hands clenched on the wheel, knuckles white as I fought the urge to pull over, to run, to do anything to escape the sound. We kept driving, speeding down the deserted mountain road, the hum growing fainter but never quite disappearing, like it had settled into the background of our lives, a permanent reminder. I wanted to believe we'd escaped, that we were finally safe. But I knew the truth. The entity, whatever it was, hadn't let us go. We hadn't left its world. It had marked us, claimed us, leaving a piece of itself inside us, a constant, silent observer, watching, waiting. As the road stretched on, the feeling of escape faded, replaced by the crushing certainty that it was far from over. We were free from the cabin. Yes, but the cabin and whatever waited inside was now part of us. And somehow, I knew it was only a matter of time before it called us back.